The French education system is a mystery to many, and as somebody who has taught in multiple schools at this point and lived in France long enough that they gave me French citizenship, which I only tell you so you know I'm not totally making all of this up. It is also, I think, at the root of a lot of interesting cultural elements of life in France. If you understand the French education system, or at least have a high-level grasp of it, I think it actually opens up some windows into understanding French people, French culture, and just where we're at in modern French society, which seems to be not doing great as with everywhere else. I'm recording this the day that our prime minister resigned like 24 hours into his job, making it possibly the shortest lived government in the Fifth Republic. I don't know. And I don't know where he went to school. I'm guessing one of the Grande École, but I'm getting ahead of it myself. My name is Jay Swanson, if you have never watched one of my videos before. And today I'm going to dive into some of my thoughts and observations about French schooling, how it has an effect on culture, and yes, why I think there are things you want to know if you're going to put your kids into a French school, with the obvious caveat that I, dear viewer, I don't have kids and don't plan on having kids. So like this is more of the outsider teacher perspective. But I have a bunch of friends who have children, and I know a whole lot of French people who have gone through the French school system. So I'm not totally talking out of my butt. I have taught in 2 high schools and 1 engineering school. I taught in a technical high school in Nice, Lycée Les Eucalyptus, and then I taught in Sarcelles, which is just north of Paris. It's on the other side of Saint-Denis. It's in one of the poorer neighborhoods surrounding Paris. And both of those experiences were very different. There was a little bit more of a free-flowing environment in Nice, which I guess you'd expect from the south of France. And in Sarcelles, those kids had really been told that they weren't going anywhere in life, and you could see it. And so I kind of, my goal, as much as anything over the course of that year, was just to instill a little bit of like hope for an ambitious future in some of those kids before I left. I don't know if it stuck or not, but there was something a little bit heartbreaking about seeing how they like knew that they were born into or lived in a poor suburb of Paris, and they were probably going to live their lives out there and not go anywhere else. That is another thing to talk about, the greater Paris region. It's something that I've learned a lot about, and I'm learning more about all the time. I would not say I'm an expert in, but it's something that I saw in person there. And then the engineering school I taught in was in Nanterre, which is to the west of Paris. But that was a post-bac. That was kind of like an education for people that already had jobs. So they were going through to get another certification. They were doing some sort of work where they had already gone out into the world a little bit. Now they were coming back to get certified. English was almost always a part of that certification process. And so I was a part of their English teaching at a higher level, which was often more fun, but also not my favorite. And again, full disclosure, I'm not a really big fan of teaching. Like, I like teaching things once because it's so much fun to coalesce my thoughts and to put it out there. The idea of showing up and teaching the same thing multiple times to different groups of people over the course of 1, let alone multiple years, to me, not what I want to be doing, which is why I'm no longer an English teacher. I just kind of fell into it. If you're interested in teaching English in France, by the way, TAPIF was the program that I did those first 2 times when I taught in high school. You can also teach in middle school and below. Obviously, the schooling that doesn't exactly align with American high school, middle school, elementary school. There's a little bit of differentiation depending on where you're at. But the TAPIF program is basically a cultural exchange if you have a college degree. It used to be a gap year thing and then something you could do right after college. I don't know exactly where the program is now, but I know a lot of people that have done it, and you don't make a lot of money, but it gets you into France legally. It gets you some teaching experience if teaching is your thing. And for me, it was just my way of legally getting into France the first couple of times. And speaking of education, if you're looking to work on your French or maybe improve your English, are you watching me right now trying to follow along with my native tongue? Well, weird. Today's video is sponsored by Lingoda. Lingoda offers a really interesting take on language learning because it's not just an online course with vocabulary, flashcards, all the stuff that you're looking to do in your off time when you're wanting to keep your language fresh. They also do actual Zoom call classes, so you can get in with a group that's at your level learning with a native teacher and speak the language. One of the things that is so challenging when it comes to learning a language is having any opportunity to speak it. When I was living in the US, I was studying French for years, but I had no French people to speak with, and Zoom didn't exist yet. I ended up doing a private lesson for this video because I didn't want to record strangers in like a group call.
Bonjour, Jay.
With a native speaker. I got Alex, who's a French teacher. Like, he taught French in high school until he ended up switching over to doing this full time. Super nice guy. Great conversation. This was actually really easy to do. Setting up my account was super fast. Getting scheduled like that, there were just available slots right out of the gate for the next day. And I signed up and I did my class and I had a really great time just chatting with them. If you'd like to use my link below, not only does it support my channel, but it supports your language learning adventure. You can jump into a course at your level with Lingoda, and if you're not sure what your level is, they have a little test you can take to figure out where you should be placed. Grab the link in the description, go check them out, get yourself in some good old-fashioned French. Or, again, like I said, if this is English speaking time for you, maybe you could use it to get some good English speaking time with an English teacher. And one who actually enjoys English, like teaching English, unlike me. You don't want to learn English from me. That's a dangerous proposition. As I've kind of alluded to, there are some challenges that I've seen within French education that have ripple effects on the culture. The main things that I want to highlight within the French education system are the major differences that I've seen across the board. These are generalizations. They're not always going to be true, but I've found them to be generally true. And the biggest one is negativity. There are a number of ways that French education is structured in which there's a very negative outlook when the teacher-patient, the teacher-student relationship. Everything from how grading is done to just how interactions occur generally between teachers and students. Editor's note, but one of the ways that this plays out that I've seen time and time again is only getting negative feedback from your teachers when you have a French teacher. And the thought that popped into my head was when I was getting my driver's license, my French driver's license. And every time I went out with him, all he would tell me was what I was doing wrong. And a few lessons in, I told him, you know how I know I'm nailing this finally? Because you shut the up. He'd stop talking because he had nothing left to criticize. It was amazing. Unfortunate though, because as an American, I need a little bit of like positive reinforcement. I wouldn't expect that necessarily from French schools, which is why you do want to be kind of aware of this stuff because it can have an impact on your kids' psychology. There are obviously going to be teachers that don't do it this way, but it's very common to see. So on the grading side, in the US, when I was going through school, at least, we started, at 100%. And anytime you missed something, you lost points. But it was assumed that you were starting from a full score. And often you could get, bonus points. You could do extra credit. You could go over the top. So there were always ways of making it up and like putting in a little bit of extra effort. On the French side, you start at 0. Everything's 0 out of 20, right? So you get scored out of 20 and you work your way up. And as a result, nobody really makes it to 20. It's very rare. If you score 17 out of 20, you're crushing it. And so it's a very different mentality out of the gate where for us in the States, it's like, I can do perfect or better than perfect. These are my goals in life. French are just like, wow, you didn't suck as bad as you probably should have in this circumstance. So just out of the gate, those numbers, that might sound superficial, but they have a very direct impact on how people see the way that they can achieve in life. The other thing is that in the US, we tend to have this very optimistic outlook of like, you can be anything you want. To a degree, this can be a sickness, right? Like obviously, if you're telling like a 5'3", like 100-pound kid that he can be a linebacker in the NFL, maybe that's stretching it. Maybe we shouldn't be telling people they can literally be anything they want. However, there's something really beautiful in that positivity and that willingness to push people towards their dreams that leads to a lot of interesting things in American culture, even affecting things like the proliferation of like street art, like people that go out and busk and play music on the street. Again, at least growing up and when I go back, street performers, people like that, there are a lot of people that have been encouraged to pursue their talents, to speak up, to put themselves out there in a way that leads to this like creativity that kind of spills out onto the streets. And in Paris, at least, it's rare to see. There aren't a whole lot of street performers that you really want to stop and listen to, unfortunately. That's a random example, but it also in France, you have this like the tall nail gets hammered down mentality. Kids often get ridiculed by their teachers for making mistakes, which makes them less likely to want to speak up. They don't really want to screw up in front of their peers. That can happen in the US too, obviously, but I think that there's more of a push towards being willing to make mistakes and learn from our errors and just try and try again is more of the US mentality. And in France, like if you try and you make a mistake, you're probably going to get put down for it. And if you tend to be the kind of person that really puts yourself out there, you might get some side eyes for that. Gad Elmaleh, I always get his name mixed, like the pronunciation of his name mixed up because of the way it's said in French, but he's a comedian that talked about that a lot, where succeeding in the US was something that he enjoyed much more than succeeding in France, because in the US we admire success, we look up to it, we aspire to it, and in France people often are suspicious of it, envious of it, and try to pull it down. And I really think that the root of that is in the negativity that you find in the school system. There's this like conformity that's pushed on people, and as a result, you don't get the same acceptance of ambition, which is why so many French creatives, is part of the reason I think, but so many French creatives have migrated to the US because opportunities are better there, but also there's more of an acceptance of it. There's a loophole for this though, because as a foreigner here in France, when people find out I'm a YouTuber, they're very interested in that. They want to know more about it. They ask me questions about it. And I think this is probably changing. I don't know how much it's changing, but when I first moved here and I met French creators, they struggled with that a lot because nobody looked at them like they were doing a real job. They would look at them like, what are you doing? Why? Like, go get a job. So the response was completely different for a French creator. They'd be like, who do you think you are? Why would anybody care to watch your stuff? And then some American walks in and they're like, ooh, interesting. Tell me more. So it's kind of like an internal club mentality of like, if you're French, you need to conform. And we're going to hammer that into you. This also makes me wonder a lot about siloing in French careers because there's not the same sense of lateral movement that happens as in American jobs, where you look at somebody's work and you say, hey, those are transferable skills to this other job and this other career over here. Maybe with a little bit of upskilling or some new training, you could do this job very well and bring a different perspective. The French are like, you studied to be a lawyer, you are a lawyer. I actually ran into this problem a lot when I was explaining what it was I did for work with my visa situation because they just didn't understand. They're like, wait, but you teach English? And I was like, yeah. And you also work for the CNRS? And I was like, yeah. And you also make videos? Yeah. And you also do this and that. And it just blew their minds. And it ended up taking a while to get to somebody who understood, or at least took the time to understand how I was cobbling my life together. A lot of French people struggle with this when they want to make career changes. I think that it might have its roots in the education system. But I think there's also probably something, let me know below if you're French especially, I think there's also something cultural behind that, but I'm not exactly sure what it is. It also ends up playing out, this is really funny, but like presentation skills, sales, customer service, so much of this falls under that unwillingness to, I guess, step outside yourself and take some of these risks. Everything is kind of rote. I realize that I'm going down the negative path here for a second, but I do think this has a huge, like an outsized impact on French people and the culture. This also ties into like presentation skills, storytelling, all these things, because you don't want to step outside and take risks and you have a prescribed way of presenting things. When I was a teacher, I told people out of the gate, and actually the school that I taught at, the engineering school, had a rule about this, trying to deprogram French students from how they made presentations. They would always start with like, I am going to present you, which is grammatically incorrect, but also boring out of the gate, right? If you're making a presentation, if you're speaking publicly, you need to have a hook. You need to like bring people in, tell a story, give them a reason to listen to you. But that's not how they're trained to do it. And they just stick with it. And it's really hard to break them out of that. And so you see how these things play out, not only in like the schools, but then in life after, when you are listening to a French presentation, you're just like, oh my God, this is it's a thing. It's absolutely a thing. However, one of the great strengths of the French education system is the strictness and the solidarity. So even if like the schools are pretty bare, they're honestly depressing half the time to walk through, there's not a lot of emphasis put on like school spirit or anything like that, because like I said, extracurricular activities are held elsewhere. Sports are not done through your school, generally speaking. There are some activities, but not as much. The nice thing is that at least there's less drama. At least the high schools that I worked in, it felt like there was less drama. It wasn't as cliquish. The kids all felt more mature to me than American high school students. And maybe that has changed over the years. But there was just something about that where I was like, oh, these are like young adults. The unified education under the government, like there's a centralized education, which again, because so much of it is rote and there's so much of it that is just like beaten into them, there's so many jokes about how the French education is like so stressful. It is a very, very intense education system. The benefit is that like there is a sense of uniformity across it, and they do seem to me to have a better sense of everything from philosophers to geography. Like the education level by and large seems higher. When you get through French high school, I would imagine if you put them up against American high schoolers of an equivalency, the French would generally have a higher sense of awareness and knowledge of the world around them. That might be playing into a stereotype, but it does feel very true. And then I keep coming back to the extracurriculars. I meant that to be its own sub thing. But one of the things that I do think is lacking, that I really benefited from as a kid, was access to really cool stuff. I grew up in a university town. my school was given so many more resources than so many schools in America, so I know that my perspective on this is probably skewed, even though I went to like just a public high school. We had a media lab and computer labs, and like I had access to cameras and editing software. I learned how to do 3D modeling, you know, in 1999. I was able to dive into so many of these things that led to the career that I have now with video production. And I haven't seen as much of that available in French schools. I think there are probably some resources, but not nearly to the same level. And there are going to be some that do have that. There are schools that specialize in it. I have a friend that teaches at a fashion school here, and they have an entire video editing program. You know, so there are places where you're going to be able to get that education. And outside of your regular high school, continuing education, there are a lot of really cool programs that are available. One of the things that's very interesting about French education is like post-school education, continuing education. One of the things that I end up paying for with my social charges is education credits. I actually have a stock of education credits I haven't used, like 2,000 or 3,000 euros, that I can put towards anything from like learning video editing to soldering to like getting a driver's license. If you can basically make the case that it'll help you in your job, there is government support that's obviously funded through taxpayer money, but like there is a very strong system in place to continue education after school. And obviously, also maybe not obvious to you depending on where you're at, but like university is so much more accessible here than it is in the States. Costs anywhere from like 170 to 600 euros a year to attend university, which is insanely cheap. When I went to university in 2003, I think it was $5,000 in tuition a year, and that was a cheap state school. So there aren't worries about student loans. There's not this insane burden placed on students in Europe in general when they're entering the workforce, when they're starting their lives. So there are a lot of huge benefits to school here as well. And even if like, as I focused early on those cultural differences and how French students do just get the shit kicked out of them like so much. I've seen it in action. I've seen teachers putting their students down and like putting them in their place. And it feels very cyclical, right? Like this teacher got beat up by his teacher, so now he's going to take it out on his students. And again, not all teachers are like that. I've also seen some amazing teachers along the way. So, you know, take all this with a grain of salt. But there's no perfect system, right? And in a lot of ways, I tend to think that the American system, if you could bring some of like the positivity, the ambition, and the outsized resources as far as like giving kids whatever interesting technical creative training they need within the context of school. Then you bring in the high standards, the like rigorous memorization, the education that you get from the French system, along with the diminished cost of higher education and the ongoing support after school. There's a really beautiful melding that could happen between the two. But it's really important to know if you are putting your kids through school, or if you're just moving to France, you're spending time with French people, to understand where they come from and what kind of like universal trauma they went through together going through French schools. Also, I was going to mention this earlier, but it's just safer. Physical safety is something that is much more assured. And they eat well. Generally, like in the canteen, they eat much better here, and everybody, to my knowledge, is fed at school here, which is really important. I realize this one was a little bit more rambly, but I hope you enjoyed this little deep dive into my observations about French education. Thanks to today's patron producer, Peggy Bergin-Sementilli. Hopefully I said that correct. That sounds like the beginning of a really nice poem, actually. Thanks to Peggy and all my patrons for making this possible. To you for watching, of course, and I will see you bright and early again one of these mornings sometime soon for another one of these, I don't know, French cultural videos or something random as we go. Thanks for watching.